The CCP tries to rewrite the history of Zero Covid. Chinese warplanes threaten Taiwan again. And President Biden protects Hongkongers. Then more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Hongkongais. You probably know that companies are collecting your personal data, but you may not realize just how many. Dozens, maybe hundreds, most of which you've never heard of, and you have no idea what they're doing with it. Hongkongais helps stop them. I'll explain more at the end. China is facing a massive natural gas shortage. That's in part because local governments have been running out of money since COVID, and they can't subsidize the cost of natural gas like they used to. A lot of China's gas is imported from Russia, but with that whole war in Ukraine thing, the costs are way up. At least that will help the I did that gas pump sticker industry. But this means people in northern China are freezing. They may not even have enough gas to cook with. So how has the great, glorious Chinese Communist Party come to the rescue? They've responded by telling local governments to provide heat without giving them money to pay for it. Well, despite the natural gas shortage, the Chinese Communist Party is doing plenty of gaslighting. That is, they're saying something that's blatantly false and trying to make you think you're crazy if you don't believe them. Like by trying to rewrite the history of Zero Covid. Remember when the Chinese Communist Party ended their Zero Covid policy on December 7th?
In theory, there'll be an end to mass testing, an end to scanning digital health codes to enter most businesses.
Okay, according to the rules, I don't officially have to do this anymore. But we're still being made to show our codes. See you.
It hadn't wholly trickled down yet.
The Communist Party announced they were dismantling Zero Covid after a wave of protests in late November, which came after a deadly apartment fire in Xinjiang.
COVID lockdown measures very likely delayed firefighters from getting to the scene.
So obviously that's what pushed the Chinese regime to end Zero Covid on December 7th, right? Wrong. The party claims it had decided to abandon the policy on November 10th, before the Xinjiang fire and the protests. That's right. We live in a post-truth world, an upside-down clown world where backwards is forwards and forwards is post-forwards, which is backwards, which is forwards. Confused? That's the point. So why is the Communist Party trying to gaslight us? Because there's something bigger they want to cover up. And that is, COVID was already spreading rapidly in China during Zero Covid. What? But that would mean that Zero Covid was a bad idea that never worked. Who could have warned anyone about that? Several times a week, for years now. There's lots of evidence of that, like how now the COVID wave in rural China is subsiding, which suggests the virus had spread before restrictions were lifted. In fact, it seems like cases were beginning to rise in late November. And as I've mentioned several times, even the World Health Organization has said that COVID-19 infections were exploding in China well before the government's decision to abandon its strict Zero Covid policy. But if the CCP can rewrite history to make it seem like they ended Zero Covid sooner, the less it looks like Zero Covid was a big fat failure. You know who doesn't find the CCP's gaslighting amusing? The dozens of COVID protesters who are still behind bars in China. After the protests in late November, authorities quietly went around to protesters' homes and took them into custody. Which is really unfair, because if the Communist Party actually ended Zero Covid in early November, like they're now claiming, then those protesters would have just been supporting the government policy, right? Like I said, upside down and post-forwards. And after the break, China sends more warplanes near Taiwan. Welcome back. The Chinese Communist Party is going after yet another religious group. This time it's a Korean Baptist group known as the Seoul Sungrak Church. Police in China have interrogated and detained local church pastors. The Communist Party is now labeling it a xiejiao, which means unorthodox teachings, often translated in English as cult. The reason for the label is so the Communist Party can go after it. the same way they've targeted other groups the CCP has labeled xiejiao, like Falun Gong. Makes sense the CCP doesn't like cults, though. They're total opposites. One is an organization that gaslights everyone and controls how people live their lives, and the other is a cult. See, if you want to be religious in China, you have two options. Either you go underground and worship freely but face persecution, or you have to belong to one of the state-run churches, like the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, which is the official Protestant church in China, which is controlled by, you guessed it, the Chinese Communist Party. The point of the state-run churches is so the party can control religion. In fact, the state-run church has even fed pastors pro-CCP talking points to deliver in sermons, just like Jesus would have wanted. You know how America has separation of church and state? In China, they're the same picture. Speaking of groups the Chinese Communist Party continues to harass, Taiwan. This week, the People's Liberation Army sent dozens of planes and vessels near Taiwan. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense says it involved 34 PLA aircraft and 9 PLA-N vessels, some of which crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait. That's this black line here, which separates Taiwan from mainland China. Until recently, China wouldn't cross that line. Now they're doing it all the time. It's another sign that the Chinese Communist Party is very, very serious about taking over Taiwan by force. But don't worry, if they succeed, all their new history books will be sure to tell you how Taiwan was always a part of China and begged to be invaded. Reintegrated further. I don't like how I'm getting fluent in this post-truth speak. In fact, a U.S. Air Force general has predicted that China will invade Taiwan in 2025. I have an entire episode about that coming out tomorrow, so keep your eyes out for that. And if you're not subscribed to China Uncensored yet, hit that subscribe button and turn the notification bell on. One country that seems to be on Taiwan's side is the Czech Republic. They've just elected a new president, Petr Pavel, who's vowed to boost ties with Taiwan. In fact, he had a phone call with Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, which, as you might guess, angered China. You also won't be surprised that China's foreign ministry spokesperson said the phone call interferes in China's internal affairs and has hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. But the new president-elect, Petr Pavel, obviously doesn't care about hurting the foreign ministry's feelings. He's riding a growing wave of anti-CCP sentiment in the Czech Republic. For a decade, the previous president was a leftist named Miloš Zeman. He cultivated closer ties with the Chinese Communist Party. Zeman had welcomed Chinese investment. During his 2 terms, China bought up a lot of Czech media companies and got heavily involved in the energy sector through a company called CEFC China Energy. Things started to go south, though, when CEFC was convicted in the U.S. for political corruption. And also its chairman got disappeared in China. Yeah, that's how doing business with China can wind up. Being surprised it ended like this is like saying, I can't believe Phil got eaten by his starving pet tiger. What are the odds? That, plus China's horrible handling of COVID, plus the way the Chinese regime seems to be influencing Czech elites, all that stuff made a lot of Czech citizens start to think twice about being so close to China. So they elected a new guy, Petr Pavel, who vowed to be more pro-Western and pro-democracy. Pavel also told the Financial Times that the West needs to accept that China is not friendly, and that the Chinese regime is not compatible with Western democracies in their strategic goals and principles, calling this a fact we have to recognize. This is actually a pretty mild, no-duh kind of statement about the CCP. But it's stunningly rare to see the leader of a Western democracy actually say this out loud. We'll see if Pavel's attitude toward the CCP holds once he takes office next month. But at least I give him points for angering China, because in the war against the CCP, even the trolls are doing their part. I see you, and I salute you. Last month, I told you how retired Hong Kong Cardinal Joseph Zen flew to the Vatican to attend the funeral of the former Pope, Benedict XVI. It was a big deal because Hong Kong authorities had taken away his passport after they arrested him for violating China's security law. Also, the CCP's whole "thou shalt have no God before me" thing. Zen's crime involved setting up a fund to pay legal and medical fees for Hong Kong protesters. But surprisingly, authorities temporarily gave him back his passport so he could fly to the Vatican. And then, also surprisingly, Cardinal Zen returned to Hong Kong after the funeral, knowing he'd probably never be allowed to leave Hong Kong again. Sadly, Cardinal Zen is now in the hospital. He's had difficulty breathing and his health has been getting worse. Not a huge surprise since he is 91 years old. Even though to some Pope Benedict was a controversial figure, Cardinal Zen said he had taken extraordinary actions to protect the Church in China. Pope Benedict had refused to sign a deal that would have allowed the Chinese Communist Party to appoint Catholic bishops in China. The current Pope, Pope Francis, however, signed it. Cardinal Zen called that an incredible betrayal. And finally today, some good news. The Biden administration is extending protections for Hong Kong residents who've come to the U.S. This is important for anyone involved in the 2019 protests, since going back to Hong Kong now is a dangerous option. The U.S. already had something in place for Hong Kong residents called the Deferred Enforced Departure Program. It allowed Hong Kongers to live and work in the U.S., but it was set to expire on February 5th. So this week, Biden extended the program for an additional 2 years. It will directly affect several thousand people. In his executive order, Biden criticized the Chinese government for its assault on Hong Kong's autonomy, undermining its remaining democratic processes and institutions, imposing limits on academic freedom, and cracking down on freedom of the press. It's rare I get to say this, but well spoken, President Biden. This comes after continual pressure on the Biden administration from Hong Kongers and rights groups in the U.S., which is to say, if you pressure your elected officials enough and do it in a way that will also help them look good to voters, you might actually be able to convince them to do the right thing. Except, of course, if you're in China, where unelected officials will just change course and say they did it before being pressured. Because over there, up is down, left is right, and black is soup. Confused? That's the point. And this episode is sponsored by Incogni. Whenever you do anything online or use apps on your phone, there's a huge number of companies that collect your personal data. When I signed up for Incogni 12 months ago, I discovered there were dozens of data brokers that potentially had my private information without my permission. And these companies can get hacked, spreading my private information even more widely. For example, a couple of weeks ago, there was a massive hack at T-Mobile. A hacker got the data of 37 million customers. And that was actually the 8th time T-Mobile has been hacked since 2018. Some of these breaches have allowed hackers to carry out SIM swaps, where they could take over your phone number for a few hours. So if you had a two-factor authentication for, say, your bank account, that becomes worthless. The point is, even the biggest companies can get hacked. What's the solution? To get as many companies as possible to delete your data first. That's what Incogni does. Incogni has already gotten my details removed from 99 of these data brokers, with a lot more in progress. And I didn't have to do anything after signing up. Incogni just handles it. So I recommend you get Incogni for yourself. Click the link below or go to incogni.com/uncensored. The first 100 people to use the code uncensored will get 20% off. Get your personal data off the market with Incogni. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.